First Baptist Church. How y'all doing this evening? Oh, what? Let's try that again. How y'all doing this evening? Oh, so much better. Okay, if you would stand. Listen, we're fixing to worship our Heavenly Father. Y'all gonna have to give me a little bit more than that. All right, we're doing songs that you know, so there's no excuse. Y'all sing it out with me. Let's worship together. For this church and for this community. This is one of my favorite hymns. hymns. And so I want you to join with me as I worship God. Just give him all the glory tonight. Sing it out with me.
I stand amazed in the presence of Jesus the Nazarene, and wonder how he could love me, a sinner condemned unclean, singing how marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. He took my sins and my sorrows, and he made them his very own. He bore the burden to Calvary and suffered and died alone. That's why we're singing how marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. And with the ransomed in glory, his face I at last shall see. It will be my joy through the ages to sing of his love for me. We're singing how marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me.
Last time, sing it out with us.
Singing how marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. Is my Savior's love for me.
Amen.
Amen. You can be seated. Good to see everybody tonight. I'm glad that you're here. Open your Bibles with me to 2 Samuel chapter 8. We're going to look at chapter 8 and 9 tonight. We'll spend most of our time in chapter 9. But I do want to read through chapter 8. It's a pretty straightforward chapter. It just simply gives a list of those kingdoms that David conquered and some of the what would now be not politically correct ways of conquering your enemy. But we'll look at that, and then we will spend the bulk of our time in chapter 9, fascinating chapter. But I like chapter 8 as well. If you remember, David is now the king in Israel. God has blessed him in everything that he's done. And here, in this chapter, it just simply gives us an overview of the various nations and peoples that David was able to subdue to give the Israelites dominion in their area or in their country. All right, 2 Samuel chapter 8, beginning in verse 1. In the course of time, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and he took Metheg Ammah from the control of the Philistines. David also defeated the Moabites. He made them lie down on the ground and measured them off with a length of cord. Every 2 lengths of them were put to death, and the 3rd length was allowed to live. So the Moabites became subject to David and brought tribute. Moreover, David fought Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah. When he went to restore his control along the Euphrates River, David captured 1,000 of his chariots, 7,000 charioteers, and 20,000 foot soldiers. He hamstrung all but 100 of the chariot horses. When the Arameans of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobah, David struck down 22,000 of them. He put garrisons in the Aramean kingdom of Damascus, and the Arameans, not Armenian, Aramean, the Arameans became subject to him and brought tribute. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. And that's really the theme of the chapter, by the way. Verse 7, David took the gold shields that belonged to the officers of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. From Tebah and Berothai, towns that belonged to Hadadezer, King David took a great quantity of bronze. When Tou, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated the entire army of Hadadezer, he sent his son Joram to King David to greet him and congratulate him on his victory in battle over Hadadezer, who had been at war with Tou. Joram brought with him articles of silver and gold, bronze. I'll stop right there just for a second. It's given me ample opportunity to say Hadadezer enough to where I'm now comfortable saying Hadadezer. I hope I'm pronouncing it right because I'll never get that out of my head. You'll notice way back in the beginning, it mentions that he defeated the Moabites, which is an interesting conversation because he made them lie down, he measured them. In other words, he killed 2/3 of them. Why is that interesting? Do you know any other Moabites? Yeah, his grandmother, Ruth, was it his grandmother or great-grandmother? Great-grandmother. All right, well, I'll say okay. I'll agree with you. His great-grandmother Ruth was a Moabitess from Moab, and so obviously they weren't Israelites, but there is some blood kin there, and maybe that's why he spared some of them. It doesn't give us any commentary on why he killed as many as he did or why he spared any of them, but he did spare them. And then if you look down in verse 9, this king, pronounce it Tou, T-O-U, maybe two, but I say Tou, the king of Hamath. He had an enemy, and his enemy was Hadadezer. And when he found out that David defeated Hadadezer, he was happy about that. So he took his son, or sent his son, to greet David and give him a gift. And it says Joram brought with him articles of silver and gold and bronze. Anytime somebody defeats your enemy, that's your friend, that's your ally, and he wanted to make that clear to David. Verse 11 says, King David dedicated these articles to the Lord as he had done with the silver and gold from all the nations he had subdued, Edom and Moab, the Ammonites, the Philistines, and Amalek. He also dedicated the plunder taken from Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah. And David became famous after he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt. He put garrisons throughout Edom, and all the Edomites became subject to David. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. Who were the Edomites again?
Descendants of Esau.
All right, Edom is a Hebrew word, means red, or the red one, and that was the name of Esau. Edom, he was also called Edom, and so the Edomites were the descendants of Esau. Verse 15, David reigned over all Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. Joab, son of Zeruiah, was over the army. Jehoshaphat, son of Helud, was recorder. Zadok, son of Ahitub and Ahimelech, son of Abithar, were priests. Sariah was secretary. Benaniah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and Pelethites, and David's sons were royal advisors. Ooh, I got through that. And again, that chapter is just a synopsis of this is where the Israelites are, this is where David is in his reign at this point, and the summary of where he is and where the Israelites are is great news. God gave him victory in everything that he did, everywhere he went. He didn't lose some and win some. He won all of them, and they had tremendous influence and strength, and they were the superpower in the entire region. That's really the gist of this, because God blessed them. With that, when I was in college and it was time for Preaching 101, which is you have to start somewhere, and I was in my class there at Hardin-Simmons University along with a bunch of other students who had never preached before in their life. None of us had any idea. We had no clue how to write a sermon, how to preach a sermon. We were just kids. We were babies. And I took this Preaching 101, and the big day came. You know, you were supposed to write your first sermon, and all these lectures that our professor, Dr. George Knight, gave us on how to write a sermon, how to prepare a sermon, and helping us to refine a topic and a subject and our points and subpoints and conclusions and introductions and all these preacher kind of terms. And the day came, and as I thought about what do I want to preach on, I picked 1 Samuel chapter 9. I've always loved 1 Samuel chapter 9 because it's about a man named Mephibosheth. I like Mephibosheth, and so this was my first sermon ever to preach in school. Now, I had preached a few times already at Possum Kingdom Resort Ministries. I spent a summer with that ministry preaching in campgrounds. My first sermon I ever preached was at Possum Kingdom State Park under a pine tree, and it was about the calling of Jacob, actually. But this was the first sermon where, you know, it had any kind of real structure or anything. I had no idea. If you were at Possum Kingdom, God bless you. But I love 2 Samuel chapter 9. And so we're going to look at this and talk about Mephibosheth just a little bit. I'm going to do a topical study a little. We're going to go through all of chapter 9, but there are a few other places in the Old Testament, and particularly in 2 Samuel, where it mentions Mephibosheth. And so I'm going to go ahead and preempt, in a preemptive manner, mention those or read through those passages as well, because it's an interesting story. 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 1. David asked, "Is there anyone still left in the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" And really, he's specific there. Is there somebody I'll honor any relative of Saul, but specifically, I really would like to honor my dear friend Jonathan, who of course died in battle. Now there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. They called him to appear before David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" "Your servant," he replied. The king asked, "Is there no one still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness?" Ziba answered the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He's crippled in both feet." Remember, there was a few weeks back that it gives one paragraph in early part of a chapter. I don't remember which chapter it was, 4, 5, 6, somewhere around there. And it just happened to mention Mephibosheth. And now here's the story of Mephibosheth. Verse 4, "Where is he?" the king asked. Ziba answered, "He is at the house of Machir, son of Amiel, in Lodabar." So King David had him brought from Lodabar, from the house of Machir, son of Amiel. When Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. David said, "Mephibosheth." "Your servant," he replied. "Don't be afraid," David said to him, "for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan." I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." Mephibosheth bowed down and said, "What is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me?" A couple things you want to note here. Mephibosheth was crippled in both feet. We found out from the other passage that while the battle was taking place and Saul and Jonathan were killed, the maidservant grabbed young Mephibosheth, just a little boy at the time, and she was running out with him. And it says he fell. Apparently she dropped him. There's no other way around it. She dropped the kid. He fell down on his feet, and it broke his feet, and they had no surgical manner of repairing that so that he would heal correctly, and so he was crippled from that day for the rest of his life. But he was born perfectly normal, perfectly healthy. He was Jonathan's son, and so there's little doubt that he probably favored Dad. He had to have looked a little bit like his dad, and perhaps it reminded David of his dear friend Jonathan. David wants to show him kindness. Now, it is not unusual for a king when he takes the throne to say, "Is there anybody left that's related to the last king?" And they say, "Yes, there is somebody left," and so they have them brought up and he's executed to get rid of the competition. And we're going to find out there's good reason for doing that. Sadly enough, there's a little kink in the story. We'll get to that later. But here, David is genuinely looking for someone to be kind to. David says to him, "Don't be afraid," which implies to me that he was probably afraid because he knows that this is really going to be a great day of his life or a terrible day, the last day of his life, depending on how David reacts. And surely he has learned and he has been told about how dear Jonathan was to David, and maybe he is hoping that it's going to go well, but he doesn't know. And so he says to Mephibosheth, "I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan." And this is no small statement that he makes here. "I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." Now, we'll get to that in just a little bit. That's an amazing statement. It is an unusual statement to be made by any king throughout history to a predecessor's grandson. It is certainly understandable, and we'll talk about this as well, that Mephibosheth bowed down and said, "Who am I that you should notice a dead dog like me?" Verse 9, "Then the king summoned Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops, so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Ziba's got a big family. He's got 15 sons and 20 servants. Verse 11. Then Ziba said to the king, and so he's going to profit, I say profit, he's going to be blessed. His sons and his servants are taken care of for life because of David's generosity to Mephibosheth. Verse 11, then Ziba said to the king, your servant will do whatever my lord the king commands his servant to do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. So twice it mentioned that he was offered by David to eat at the king's table, and the third time it mentions that in fact that took place. From then on he ate at the king's table, which means that David saw Mephibosheth on a regular basis just like he saw his sons. Verse 12, Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah, and all the members of Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table, and he was crippled in both feet. I find it an interesting epitaph there at the end that it mentions again that he was crippled in both feet. It almost doesn't matter at this point. Now, for many, it would make a big difference, but he is now, instead of a beggar, where most crippled people end up, at the gate, begging and pleading for a few pennies or a piece of bread. He is now one of the richest men in the nation, one of the richest men in the entire nation. And that's because David cared for him. And he cared for him, and this is how he demonstrated that he cared for him. He cared for him by making him family. So how did he do that? The first thing he did was he overlooked his problems. He was crippled in both feet. In that day and time, it meant something different than this day and time. Today, that doesn't have any connection with the quality of the individual or whether we think highly or badly of them. Whatever your disability may be, people don't generally look down on you because you're tall or short or you have some sort of deformity or you're redheaded or you're bald or whatever it is. We accept that we're all different and some of us have physical limitations, and we're okay with that. We're a diverse group. Back then, 3,000 years ago, people had connected, especially in Israel, God's judgment on those who had deformities. If bad things happened to you, they believed good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people, and if something bad has happened to you, like you were dropped and you crippled in both feet, that is the judgment of God upon you or your family. David didn't care. He didn't see it that way. He saw past that, and he saw the son of his dear friend Jonathan. He overlooked the problems. Secondly, he restored his inheritance, and we read that in just a moment ago. And he didn't say, look, Saul had too much land for you to have all of it. You don't need all that land. You don't need all of that inheritance, of course. You're just the grandson, so I'll give you a portion of what Saul had, and that still would have been spectacular because he's not being executed. David could have said, look, I'm not going to give you anything, but I won't kill you. How about that? And he would have said, okay, that's a good deal. Ends up with nothing, and we'll get to that in just a minute, at least as far as we know. But here he has now collected all of Saul's lands and territories because of the generation of David, and David did it because of Jonathan. He restored his inheritance. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 3 says this. This is Peter speaking. Wise apostle Peter, having grown from the immature, egotistical, short-tempered fisherman that he once was as a disciple, many years later he says this in 1 Peter 1:3. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And listen to this part. And into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade, kept in heaven for you. Peter specifically talks about an inheritance that we have as God's people that is in heaven right now waiting for us. I'm not even sure what all that means, but I can't wait to find out in heaven. It's an inheritance. Whether Mephibosheth knew it or not, or ever thought about it or not, or ever dreamed about it or not, he has now received his full inheritance from King Saul. So he restored his inheritance. He overlooked his problems. But we see, and this is really astounding, Mephibosheth ate at David's table. And of course, our tables are reserved for family members. I've had some of you over to my house to eat at my table, and I've eaten at some of your tables. And I'm happy to eat all of your tables, by the way. But that doesn't necessarily make me family, because if I showed up every night at your table, you might find that a little bit odd. Because every night at the table, that's for your kids, that's for your spouse, that's for your direct family. And so when David said to Mephibosheth, I'm going to allow you to eat at my table every Christmas, which would have been an odd thing to say 1,000 years before Christ. But I'll let you eat at my table for every Jewish festival. That would have been astounding, but he didn't say that. He doesn't say to Mephibosheth, you are going to be my special guest at these occasions. He's not a special guest. He is a member of the family because he says, you will eat at my table every night, just like my family, just like my children. So David cared for him by making him family, one of the family members. Jesus is at his Last Supper with his disciples before he is arrested, only hours before. In fact, as soon as they finish the meal, he's going to pass the cup and the bread around and teach them this Lord's Supper that we celebrate even today. And then he's going to go out to the Garden of Gethsemane, where he's going to agonize in prayer to the point of sweating drops of blood. And then he's going to be arrested, tried, and crucified. He'll be on the cross by the next morning. Among his last words that he says to his disciples, these 12 men are now 11 men sitting in this room. In Luke chapter 22, verse 29, Luke 22, 29, he says, and I confer, he's speaking to the disciples, I confer on you a kingdom, just as my Father conferred one on me, so that you may, listen to what it says, so that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, again, that's saying a lot. You may eat at my table in my kingdom. Where is he talking about? Now, apparently, if he's speaking literally, there's eating in heaven. I like that. Eating and drinking in heaven. You know, Welch's grape juice, of course. But Jesus says it this way, you're going to be a part of my family in my kingdom. Unfortunately, and this is where the story turns, David may have been betrayed by Mephibosheth. We don't know for sure, and we'll get to that in a minute. But if you look with me in 2 Samuel chapter 16, so depart from where you are for just a minute, go back to go forward to 2 Samuel chapter 16, about 7 or 8 chapters. 2 Samuel chapter 16, verse 1. When David had gone a short distance beyond the summit, there was Ziba, remember Ziba? The steward of Mephibosheth, waiting to meet him. He had a string of donkeys saddled and loaded with 200 loaves of bread, 100 cakes of raisins, 100 cakes of figs, and a skin of wine. The king asked Ziba, why have you brought these? Ziba answered, the donkeys are for the king's household to ride on. The bread and fruit are for the men to eat, and the wine is to refresh those who become exhausted in the desert. The king then asked, where is your master's grandson? But speaking of Mephibosheth. Ziba said to him, he's staying in Jerusalem because he thinks, today the house of Israel will give me back my grandfather's kingdom. Then the king said to Ziba, all that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours. So Ziba comes to the king, comes to David, and he butters him up with all of these donkeys and all of this food and this wine. And David says, where's Mephibosheth? And he says, well, he's back in Jerusalem, and he's counting the days until you die in battle, because he thinks the moment you're dead, the kingdom will revert back to him. In other words, Ziba is saying Mephibosheth has turned on you. He's decided he wants to be king. And he's hoping for your demise so he can take over the kingdom of Israel. Now, whether that's true or not, I'll let you decide. So when David hears that, it's interesting that David, I'm a little sad at this, doesn't pray about it. He doesn't go before God and say, God, could you send Nathan the prophet to tell me whether or not this is true? Could you give me a sign? Who's telling me the truth? Is it Ziba or is it Mephibosheth? Is Mephibosheth really doing this? He doesn't. He instead immediately replies to Ziba, everything that I gave to Mephibosheth, I give to you. Wow. There's no chance for a defense or anything like that. Sounds bad. And I'm sad that David did that. I would hope that he would allow at least Mephibosheth to mount. But wait, there is a response from Mephibosheth. Where are we? We're in chapter 16, 3 chapters later in 2 Samuel chapter 19, verse 24, if you'll turn there with me. 2 Samuel 19:24. Just a few chapters over. Says this, Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson, also went down to meet the king. He had not taken care of his feet or trimmed his mustache or washed his clothes from the day the king left until the day he returned. So we know he's got a mustache, by the way. There you go. When he came from Jerusalem to meet the king asked him, why didn't you go with me, Mephibosheth? He said, my lord the king, since I, your servant, am lame, I said, I will have my donkey saddled and will ride on it so I can go with the king. But Ziba, my servant, betrayed me. And he has slandered your servant to my lord the king. My lord the king is like an angel of God, so do whatever pleases you. All my grandfather's descendants deserve nothing but death from my lord the king. But you gave your servant a place among those who sat at your table. So what right do I have to make any more appeals to the king? Then the king said to him, why say more? I order you and Ziba to divide the fields. Mephibosheth said to the king, let him take everything, now that my lord the king has arrived home safely. Well, that's an interesting story. It makes me want to side with Mephibosheth. He says to David, when David says, why didn't you come out? Why didn't you ride along? And Mephibosheth said, actually, I had every intention of doing that. That was the plan, but Ziba betrayed me. It was premeditated, he says. And so Ziba left him and then made up this story, according to Mephibosheth. He made up this story and threw me under the bus. Now, he wouldn't have said bus, but threw me under the camel. How about that? And he says, I would never have thought that. I would never have done that. And you've been so kind to me. I and my descendants deserve nothing but death, and yet you've given me a place at your table, which is all true and sounds like it's in character with Mephibosheth, the very one who said, who am I that you should notice a dead dog like me? Ziba never said anything like that. So the king said to him, why say more? Which sounds to me like he, at least to some extent, believes Mephibosheth. Now, in an immediate reversal of his judgment, or partial reversal, I think he throws in the towel and says, I don't know who's telling me the truth. One of them's lying to him. You would think David would have said, I'm going to do an investigation, and one of you is going to get everything, and the other one I'm going to execute. I'll get to the bottom of this. But he doesn't say that. Instead, what does he say? I give you both half. I don't know. I don't get that logic, but he does say that. Maybe it's a test on Mephibosheth to see where his heart really is, like Solomon when he threatens to cut the baby in half between the two moms to find out who the real mom is. Maybe David is doing this with Mephibosheth and says, I'll give you half and I'll give him half. And Mephibosheth answers pretty wisely. He says he can have it all. And what I'd like to know is what actually happened in the end, what happened after that, as to whether or not Mephibosheth ever collected on that or was taken care of or would have been completely destitute if David held him to that statement and gave him nothing. But we do have a little hint, and we'll end with this. Look with me in 2 Samuel chapter 21, verse 1. Just a couple more chapters over, chapter 21, verse 1. David protected Mephibosheth. This is an odd story. It's an odd thing. By the way, you might think to yourself, and I would think to myself, the good thing about the name Mephibosheth is you're the only kid in school with that name. But not 3,000 years ago, there's another Mephibosheth in the Bible. Look with me in 2 Samuel chapter 21, verse 1. During the reign of David, there was a famine for 3 successive years. So David sought the face of the Lord. The Lord said, "It is on account of Saul and his blood-stained house. It is because he put the Gibeonites to death." Now God says something has happened to cause this famine. He says this to David. David, this famine is not random. This is judgment, and it's because of the house of Saul. And he says what the house of Saul did. They put Gibeonites to death, and that's a story we went through, and God is saying what they did was wrong. They should not have done this, and now judgment is coming on the Israelites because of it. Verse 2, the king summoned the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not a part of Israel, but were survivors of the Amorites. The Israelites had sworn to spare them, but Saul, in his zeal for Israel and Judah, had tried to annihilate them. David asked the Gibeonites, "What shall I do for you? How shall I make amends so that you will bless the Lord's inheritance?" In other words, David is saying to the Gibeonites, I want this drought to end, and this is the only way I can fix it is to give you what you guys want. What do you want? Verse 4, the Gibeonites answered him, "We have no right to demand silver or gold from Saul or his family, nor do we have the right to put anyone in Israel to death," which is exactly what they're going to do. "What do you want me to do for you?" David asked. So they answered the king. This is the real answer. That was just pretense. "As for the man who destroyed us and plotted against us so that we have been decimated and have no place anywhere in Israel," that's Saul, "let 7 of his male descendants be given to us to be killed and exposed before the Lord at Gibeah of Saul, the Lord's chosen one." So the king says, "I will give them to you." So you get the request. We don't have a right to say anything, but if you insist, if you'd really like to know, give us 7 descendants of Saul. We're going to cut them open and kill them and hang out their bodies, and then we'll be satisfied. Which is a dumb request. They could have asked for gold or something good. Anyway, they want vengeance. Typical. Anyway, so the king says, "I'll do it. I'll give them to you." Now, here's the kicker of that. Mephibosheth would be right in line with one of the ones who would be killed. But, verse 7, the king spared Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the oath before the Lord between David and Jonathan, son of Saul. David made an oath, and he says, "I'm going to honor that oath." And he remembered that oath. And he says, "I can't touch Mephibosheth." Verse 8, but the king took Armoni and Mephibosheth, the 2 sons of Ahiah's daughter, Rizpah. So that's the other Mephibosheth. It's the only time he's mentioned, whom she had borne to Saul, together with the 5 sons of Saul's daughter Merab, who she had borne to Adriel, son of Barzillai, the Maholathite. He handed them over to the Gibeonites, who killed and exposed them on a hill before the Lord. Now, again, that's a strange story, but it does show us that David made an effort to protect Mephibosheth. And this is after all of those other things have happened. David steps in to save his life. In the end, David embraced Mephibosheth out of love for his son, out of love for his father, Jonathan. I may have shared with you before, or maybe you've heard this story before, Jackie Robinson, who was a baseball player from many years ago, but so famous. He was a great player, but he is perhaps best known for having been the first African American to play Major League Baseball. While breaking baseball's color barrier, he faced the boos and the insults of crowds in every stadium. While playing one day in his home stadium in Brooklyn, he committed an error. His own fans began to ridicule him. He stood at second base, humiliated, while his own fans booed him. That's when shortstop Pee Wee Reese called for a timeout and walked toward Robinson and stood next to him. The teammate from the South, a white man who in that time and place would have been the last person expected to do anything for Robinson, stood there and put his arm around Jackie Robinson and faced the crowd. The fans grew quiet. Robinson later said that arm around his shoulder saved his career. Mephibosheth was that man. He was probably looked down on most. He was kind of left over from a previous kingdom. But David loved him and embraced him and put his arm around him and made him family. And in the end, David spared his life. Of course, there's a direct correlation between Mephibosheth and you and me, and that's what made it so fascinating to me that I wanted to make it my first sermon in school. I was fascinated with Mephibosheth because he was crippled. He had disabilities. I didn't feel any different. Skinny kid. Didn't have a deep, resonant voice. Still don't. Didn't fit the part. I was an introvert. I identified with Mephibosheth. There's a little bit of Mephibosheth in all of us. But God in his mercy will use us and love us and embrace us and make us a part of the family, just like Mephibosheth. All right, any comments or questions before we look at our prayer sheet for the week? All right, take out your prayer sheet and...